I think the biggest misconception is probably the story we tell ourselves. For a long period of time, I told myself that I'm a writer, not an entrepreneur. Therefore, I can only write, not start a business, until Substack came along, which is the platform that I publish my newsletter on. And it allows writers to make money. So suddenly you have to kind of think like an entrepreneur, even though that wasn't a skill you thought you could ever need or use.
Health, fitness, mindset, nutrition. Live better and longer. I'm Saad Alam, and let's hone in. Something that you wrote, and it was a chapter about creativity being a skill and not a talent. And God, I love that so much, because I tell people that I become creative by falling over myself and failing more times than anyone else and just being enthusiastic every time I get up. And, tell me about how you came up with that, because I wish it's the skill that more people could take on.
Yeah, it's so funny. Pretty much every chapter where it's something mushy like creativity or relationships or leadership or something like that, I really tried to explain that those things are skills. Even something as mushy as love is still a skill. It's not just something that you're born with or that falls from the sky. Or creativity, for a long period of time, everyone used to attribute it to God. It's something you are born with. Painters, that was a God-given trait. Or the muses gave you the gift of whatever. But I'm sure a lot of people like this. I know a lot of creative people who say, oh, I can't create right now because I'm waiting for inspiration. And I don't know, for me, it's never been like that, probably because for journalism, it's a somewhat creative. You're writing and you're putting things together, but you have a deadline. I can't tell my editor, like, I had to wait to be inspired. So I've always had a hard deadline. So I know, yes, I can be creative in this kind of environment. And I think it was Aaron Sorkin who said, you need structure in order to be creative. Otherwise, if it's completely unstructured freedom, it's the same as finger painting. The other is art. One is finger painting, one is art. So I used to always say, like, only break the rules if you know the rules. And a really good example in the creativity chapter is Grant Achatz, who is this really innovative, cutting-edge chef who created the top restaurant in the world at one point, named Alinea in Chicago. And he was a super creative chef, like very cutting edge, very innovative. And then he got stage 4 tongue cancer. It's like, what are the odds of like the best chef in the world getting tongue cancer? And then everybody was like, oh my goodness, well, suddenly you're not going to be creative, like, because as a chef, the taste, your tongue, that's where taste comes from. And he developed all these systems that were creative acts, but they were rooted in logic. And it weirdly made him even more creative. And I think, like you said like the failure aspect of it. Every 6 months, he does this. Ed Catmull from Pixar does this. Every 6 months, Grant will force his team to blow up the entire menu, no matter how successful and how amazing and popular it was, because he didn't want to breed complacency. He was like, I want you to start over. Even if we create something that's crap, it forces us to start over every 6 months and experiment and try and innovate, instead of just doing the same repetitive thing that's worked for the past X amount of years.
How do you think someone that's not creative can become creative? Because I also think there's a story that a lot of people tell themselves, that if I'm not creative, I will never be able to get there. I'm a logic person. I'm a math person.
Yeah, I think so. The biggest misconception is probably the story we tell ourselves. For a long period of time, I told myself that I'm a writer, not an entrepreneur. Therefore, I can only write, not start a business, until Substack came along, which is the platform that I publish my newsletter on. And it allows writers to make money. So suddenly you have to kind of think like an entrepreneur, even though that wasn't a skill you thought you could ever need or use. So, to me, it's like, okay, let's say you're a really logical person. You're like, I'm not creative enough. Create time in your schedule to be creative and do the thing that you genuinely enjoy. The top grossing, the newsletter that makes the most money on Substack is a newsletter about salads. So it's like, there's any activity or any hobby that you have could potentially be a business. It doesn't have to be, but I always say that you should do something that you only do for yourself, because that is a creative act in and of itself, whether it's running or writing or doing a podcast. You don't have to figure out how it should make money. Just do the thing that you enjoy. And I do believe that, like, a lot of us are more than just our job titles. I'm sorry, if you're an investment banker, you weren't born destined to be an investment banker. You have other passions and like interests. So it's exploring those. And I think the creativity will naturally come.
It's really interesting. I have come to the conclusion that I'm the most happy when I'm actually being creative. And it's so hard running a company, have a million things coming at you, also trying to be a family man, to find time to be creative. And so what I started doing is I started thinking about what are the different activities I do in order to be creative, or when do I have my most creative moments? And mine became a ritual of sorts. So it is, I write down the problem I'm trying to solve. I actually do a little light brainstorming beforehand. I put my world on do not disturb. I throw a pair of headphones on, pre-curate a playlist, and this sounds silly, but it is violin dubstep music. And then I caffeinate really hard, and this has to start at 3:00 in the afternoon. And then I have a whiteboard either in my place, which was the first thing I put up, or in a WeWork. And for 6 hours, once I get lost, I get lost. And a lot of stuff doesn't make sense, whatever comes on the whiteboard. It's a lot of pictures I take, but it is arguably the time I have to basically create like a safe space. And I do it twice a week. And if I don't do it, the quality of the ideas is just so much worse.
Yes. And there's a ton of research to back this, but in the book, I actually talk about two things that are exactly related to what you just said. So a lot of CEOs, they started off as founders of these small businesses where you had to be really creative to start this business in the first place. So they would start the business, then the business would be successful, it would grow in size, and then they found themselves being more of a CEO manager, and their calendar would be filled with meetings and calls and all this stuff. And then suddenly they realize, oh, wait a second, I'm not doing the thing that made the business successful in the first place, which is that brainstorming and creative brainstorming type thing. So a lot of them will, once they realize that, put chunks on their calendar for this exact thing, whether it's like 4 hours at a time or something, where you're not constantly interrupted. Sarah Blakely, who's the founder of Spanx, she buckets her time in days because she doesn't like the constant context switching. So she doesn't like having a marketing call at 10 a.m. and then at 11 product and then whatever. So she'll be like, Tuesdays are just for product, Wednesdays are just for marketing, Thursdays maybe are my day for brainstorming and things like that. The other thing that you mentioned is like a mental ritual. It's really interesting. I do this too, and I didn't realize I did it until I read what Shonda Rhimes does. She's a writer. She writes like these very, very addicting television shows like Grey's Anatomy. And they're like, okay, how do you get in the mood to be creative and to write? And she says that every single night she goes into her little office, she lights a candle and she makes green tea, and even the movements are similar because that tells your brain, okay, now it's time. And there's something about that mental switch, like now it's time to brainstorm or have ideas, that puts you in the right mindset, or what they would consider the muses or the inspiration. And then you're able to create because you're not like tight and busy. I do the same thing. I write at night. And I think to me, it's like I always like I would have, this is really random, like a tiny, those baby size, like Cokes, like Coca-Cola, not great for your health, but great for writing. And it would be right there. I would open it. I would be like, okay, now it's time to write. And then I would just go. So yeah, I think like creating some sort of little, it could be as simple as you have tea at night, simple ritual to tell your brain it's time to be creative.
It's another thing, and I don't mean to derail the conversation, but one of the conclusions we've come to is that if people don't find their zone of genius, which very often is like their zone of creativity, it isn't a good fit for our particular culture at our company. And so one of the things we quite literally, I would argue, maybe the number one or number two trait that we hire for is when people come to us and they, we're a little bit bigger now. And so you've got to find people that are more managers. But we always tell them that as co-founders of the business, we all love playing in the dirt. And they were like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, look, we are so deeply operational and we love being creative. And it's the early stage stuff that is so ambiguous that gives us so much joy that you have to rip it out of our hands. And if you're not that kind of person, it's not going to be a good fit, because we like working with people that are inherently willing to solve problems through creativity. And that's how you maintain that kind of like small feeling, even as you scale the business.
Exactly. That's a really good point. Playing in the dirt.
Playing in the dirt. We say it all the time. People always give you that. What the hell is this guy talking about?